Hi girls, here's the first video for growth and dynamic homeostasis. In this video I'm answering questions 8 through 11, looking at thermoregulation, osmoregulation, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, and finally biotic and abiotic factors. The rest will be answered later. Okay, so looking at environmental effects, growth and dynamic homeostasis of a biological system are influenced by changes in the system's environment. Makes sense? All biological systems, from cells and organisms to populations, communities, and ecosystems, are affected by complex abiotic interactions involving the exchange of matter and free energy. So what do those words mean? Well, first of all, biotic, we should know based off of biology. Biology is the study of life, so that is all living components of an ecosystem. Abiotic is going to be the non-living chemical, physical components in the ecosystem. So even looking at this picture here, our biotic factors would be all of these trees, the organisms living in the trees, and our abiotic factors is going to be the weather, the soil, whatever that's, if that's rock or soil, water, nutrients, etc. So cellular and organism activities, as well as the structure of ecosystems, are affected by their biotic and abiotic environments. They can be both negative or positive interactions. So cell activities are affected by interaction with biotic and abiotic factors. When cell density is high, the rate of cell division will decrease in response to availability of space and nutrients in the environment. So, looking here, cell counts 3 days after seeding against initial density. So cell density after 3 days of growth and initial seeding density. You can see that we're increasing, and finally up here we're starting to level out and maybe even come down. We'll do some activities looking at population growth in class this week and symbiotic relationships. So a lot of this will be reinforced in class. Okay, so when environmental conditions and cell density are sufficient, prokaryotes can form biofilms. Cells communicate via chemical signals and adhere to form a layer on the surface. Extracellular polymers irreversibly bind the cells together. So how does temperature affect it? Temperature affects cells by affecting activity of enzymes within the cells. So, and we'll look at what enzymes do later on in the year, but essentially enzymes are going to speed up reactions that are occurring within the cell. So you can see this is the activity of enzymes essentially. Looking at their velocity, you can see that it's increasing. Up here is actually where it's probably optimal conditions because you can see that it's the highest velocity, so it's moving the most. And then at a certain point here at 40 degrees Celsius, it dives down, and that's because at this point, those enzymes can no longer function. So this is how temperature would affect cells. Once again, I'm looking at these abiotic factors, how they affect life. So that's temperature, and then cell density. So in cell density, the forming of biofilms and rate of cell division, which makes sense because if cell density is high, that means there's a lot of cells. That means that the cell division is going to stop happening because there's no more space. Okay, so let's look at sunlight. Sunlight increases the rate of photosynthesis in autotrophic cells. However, overexposure can have a bacterial effect on many species, phytoplankton and microscopic algae. And we are going to look at eutrophication this week as well through a lab demo. So make sure you come into class knowing what eutrophication is. I will ask you this week. Okay, activities at the organism level. So we're looking at cells now. Let's look at the whole organism, how they're affected. This is seen in symbiotic relationships, predator-prey relationships, water and nutrient availability, salinity, temperature. So symbiosis is basically this term that we use for any sort of interaction between two organisms. So the main ones we're going to look at are mutualistic, commensalistic, parasitic, and we'll also look at amensalism. I don't think I have it in this slide, but you will practice it this week. So symbiosis is just that relationship. It doesn't describe the relationship, it just says there is one between two organisms. So parasitism is an interaction when one species benefits and the other species is actually harmed. And that's important to know that because they differ slightly. So it's important to know in parasitism, one benefits, one is harmed. So in this one, this wasp has injected a moth with its eggs, which is really gross. And basically, the eggs, they feed on it until they hatch. And so this moth is obviously the species being harmed, and the wasp is the one benefiting because the wasp eggs have food. Mutualism is a relationship in which species benefit from interacting with each other, so both of them benefit. Your example is that clownfish are protected by the stinging anemone of tentacles. Stinging anemone tentacles, in return, they protect the anemone from zebrafish. So both the clownfish and the anemone are benefiting by this relationship. Commensalism is one organism benefits specifically, the other one is not affected at all. So in this example, we have this shark the remora, that follows around the zebra shark because the zebra shark is helping the remora to avoid predators. So the shark is not affected by this whatsoever, but the remora is benefiting. Another one is cattle egrets, which live near cattle, and they actually will eat insects stirred up by the cattle, but the cattle have no benefit from this relationship. So it's commensalism. So predator-prey relationships form when one species kills and eats another, obviously, and the abundance of each species affects the abundance of the other. This is seen in the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. So what it's important to notice here is these, densities of the population or densities of the organism are similar with the prey and the predator, which makes sense because if the predator is high, it eats a lot of the prey, which means that it's going to decrease. And they're in this intertwined relationship where if one species goes down, so does the other one, and it's just kind of back and forth. And that's also why you see it go so high and so low, is because that relationship constantly is changing. So water availability is going to affect populations, obviously. Gases and nutrients are transported through organisms by being dissolved in water, so it's a necessary chemical for life. So here's the water moving up through the xylem and glucose through the phloem, which are, think of them as the way I would describe it is the arteries and veins of the human. It's the same thing with plants, that's the xylem and phloem. So environmental salinity affects osmoregulation in organisms. In order for organisms, or to survive, organisms are adapted to exist in a certain range of salinity. So, and salinity, of course, is salt. So, for example, the Dead Sea has a really, really high salinity. There's a lot of salt in it. So the fish and aquatic plants cannot survive in it. However, some microscopic organisms that are used to that type of salinity are able to survive here. And remember, osmoregulation is that movement of water. And just to kind of go in depth and bring this back to earlier learning targets, the reason that animals would not be able to live in such a high salinity environment is because of this osmoregulation or osmosis. If it's so salty outside, water is going to be lost from those cells to go outside into the water and would be really, really difficult to maintain those internal conditions. So organisms are adapted to survive in certain temperature ranges as well. Extreme temperatures can interfere with enzyme activity that you saw before. So optimal temperatures of enzymes often reflects that of the habitat. For example, enzymes in Arctic fish have near sub-zero optimal temperatures. On the other hand, thermophiles are organisms adapted to live in habitats with really high temperatures, and so their enzymes obviously function in really warm temperatures. So stability of populations is affected by those interactions between biotic and abiotic factors, which include water and nutrient availability, nesting materials in sites, food chains, species and population, species diversity, population density. So the availability of nesting sites and materials influences the size of bird populations, obviously, because if there's no place for them to live, then they can't have a large population. Availability of water and nutrients affects the size of populations as well as their distribution, so where they are actually located. You can always count that life is where water is. So food chains and food webs can affect communities and population sizes. If producers increase, higher trophic levels increase as well. If predators increase, then lower trophic levels decrease. So let's look at this one, this situation on the right. Our top predator has been eliminated, and so what that does is that increases this middle trophic level species because there's nothing there to consume it. So if that happens, well, then this middle trophic level needs something to eat, which means that it's going to be consuming more of this lower trophic level, this producer, and so eventually we're going to run out of a food source for this middle trophic level. That's why it's so important to have this entire chain, this balance, so that way any trophic levels really are not affected. Greater species diversity leads to greater ecosystem stability. Okay, so what does that mean? Species diversity is the amount of different types of species, different types of organisms within an ecosystem. That makes an ecosystem more stable because there's different ways that energy can flow. If all the species in a certain environment had only one food source, that really ties them down, and then if something happens to this food source, it all dies, it catches on fire, whatever happens, all the species are affected. Whereas here, if we have a lot of different means of energy flow, then a disruption can happen, a disturbance can happen, and that ecosystem will survive still. Okay, population density affects the stability of communities and ecosystems. As population size increases, density-dependent factors can affect growth. So that can be food availability, predation, disease. Changes in a given population affect others, obviously, in that food web. Here's some more links for you if you are curious, and I will get the next videos. I have 2 more coming out to you guys soon.